The year is 1781, and the American Revolution is currently standing on the absolute brink of disaster. In the South, British General Charles Cornwallis is ruthlessly sweeping through everything in his path. To make matters worse, America's most infamous traitor, Benedict Arnold, is leading British troops to systematically burn Virginia. The Continental Army is completely desperate. They are rapidly running out of ammunition, severely lacking food supplies, and most importantly, they are entirely blind. General Marquis de Lafayette, the young Frenchman personally tasked by Washington to defend Virginia, finds himself hopelessly stuck in a deadly cat-and-mouse game that he is sure to lose. To survive, Lafayette desperately needs a miracle or a spy. But the one man who ultimately salvaged this entire war, weaving a masterful web of lies that made the mighty British Empire suffer, wasn't a formally trained general or a politician. It was a man born entirely in chains, possessing no citizenship, no property, and no freedom. His name was James Armistead. And this is the incredible story of how an enslaved man single-handedly fooled Britain's greatest general, leading directly to the collapse of their entire North American campaign. In the spring of 1781, James Armistead did something entirely unthinkable. He approached his enslaver, William Armistead, and asked for permission to join Lafayette's army. But General Lafayette didn't just need another private holding a musket on the front lines. He desperately needed eyes deeply embedded within the enemy ranks. And so, James volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission. The plan was brilliantly simple, yet carried an astronomically high level of risk. James would pose as a runaway slave and quietly sneak into the heavily guarded British encampment. The stakes were absolute. If caught by American patrols, he could be hanged for desertion. If the British discovered his intentions, he would be tortured to death for espionage. He had no safety net or protection. Despite the overwhelming danger, James successfully infiltrated the camp of Benedict Arnold. He survived by weaponizing the very prejudices of his enemies. By deliberately acting as an illiterate, harmless runaway, desperate for freedom under the British flag, he rapidly gained their complete trust. He was put to work doing menial labor. He cleaned up after the officers, served their meals, carried their heavy equipment, and most importantly, he listened. The arrogant British officers never bothered to lower their voices when discussing highly sensitive military tactics in front of an enslaved man. To them, James was completely invisible, nothing more than a walking piece of furniture. They didn't see a threat. They didn't see a brilliant tactician. That arrogance was Britain's first fatal mistake. But James's ultimate trial was just beginning. When Benedict Arnold relocated his forces, James was transferred directly into the service of General Charles Cornwallis himself, the supreme commander of the British military in the South. Cornwallis was a brilliant tactician, but he was deeply impressed by James's apparent knowledge of the local Virginia terrain. Cornwallis was so thoroughly convinced of James's absolute loyalty to the crown that he made a decision that would ultimately cost him the war. He actually decided to use James as a spy to scout the Americans. Just think about the sheer absurdity of this historical moment. The supreme commander of the British military had just officially recruited America's best spy, explicitly asking him to go spy on the American forces. James Armistead was now officially a master double agent. And this is exactly where his silent, deadly genius truly flourished. When James crossed back into the British camp, he fed Cornwallis highly detailed, top-secret intelligence that was completely fabricated. He consistently reported that Lafayette's forces were massively larger than they actually were, which caused the typically aggressive Cornwallis to hesitate and not launch a full-scale attack, buying the Americans desperate time. Meanwhile, James smuggled priceless, completely accurate intelligence back to Lafayette, detailing British troop numbers, artillery placements, and Cornwallis's intended movements. Because of this silent, invisible operative, Lafayette was always staying one crucial step ahead of total annihilation, just like he was reading Cornwallis's own tactical playbook. By the late summer of 1781, the blistering Virginia heat was matched only by the boiling frustration of General Charles Cornwallis. He had spent months chasing the Marquis de Lafayette through the wilderness, a grueling campaign that had exhausted his men and depleted his supplies. Cornwallis was a seasoned veteran, a predator used to cornering his prey. But Lafayette was a ghost. And Cornwallis had absolutely no idea that the reason he could never catch this ghost was because of the quiet, unassuming enslaved man pouring his tea and cleaning his boots. Believing Lafayette's forces to be much larger and far better equipped than they actually were, thanks entirely to the steady stream of poisoned intelligence spoon-fed to him by James Armistead, Cornwallis made a fateful, catastrophic decision. He needed a place to rest, resupply, and await reinforcements from the mighty Royal Navy. Under direct orders from his superior, General Henry Clinton in New York, Cornwallis marched his entire Southern army of over 8,000 elite British and Hessian soldiers to a small, sleepy tobacco port on a peninsula. The town was called Yorktown. Militarily speaking, a peninsula is a double-edged sword. With naval supremacy, it's an impenetrable fortress, a perfect point of extraction. But without control of the sea, it is a suffocating death trap. Cornwallis was supremely confident. After all, Britannia ruled the waves. What could possibly go wrong? What went wrong was James Armistead. The moment Cornwallis finalized his strategy to fortify Yorktown and wait for the British fleet, James absorbed every single detail of the plan. He memorized troop numbers, defensive layouts, artillery positions, and the exact timeline of the British encampment. He then risked his life one more time, slipping out of the British camp under the cover of darkness, navigating heavily armed patrols, and delivering a game-changing, highly detailed report directly to Lafayette. When Lafayette read James's intelligence, he immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. Cornwallis hadn't just built a base, he had backed himself into a corner. Lafayette immediately dispatched an urgent, desperate courier galloping north to New York, carrying James's intelligence straight to the Commander-in-Chief, General George Washington. Up in New York, Washington was obsessed with retaking Manhattan from the British. But when he received Lafayette's letter, completely corroborated by James Armistead's impeccable ground-level intelligence, Washington realized that a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity had just presented itself. This wasn't just a chance to win a battle. It was a chance to decapitate the entire British war effort in North America. Based entirely on the word of an enslaved spy, Washington made the ultimate gamble. Washington ordered his combined American and French forces, under the command of the brilliant French General Rochambeau, to immediately break camp and execute a grueling 400-mile forced march to the south. To ensure General Clinton in New York didn't realize they were leaving and send reinforcements to Cornwallis, Washington orchestrated a massive phantom army deception. He left behind a skeleton crew to keep campfires burning, set up fake artillery made of painted logs, and intentionally let false dispatches fall into British hands. The deception worked flawlessly. By the time the British High Command in New York realized the main American army was gone, Washington was already marching through Philadelphia. But the trap was only half complete. For Yorktown to become Cornwallis's tomb, the Americans needed to sever his lifeline to the sea. Just as Washington's forces arrived to lock down the land routes, a massive French naval fleet, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, appeared on the horizon. In early September, at the pivotal Battle of the Capes, the French fleet clashed with the British Royal Navy. In a stunning upset, the French heavily damaged the British ships, forcing them to retreat back to New York. The jaws of the trap snapped shut. The land was sealed. The sea was blocked. Cornwallis, the terror of the South, looked out at the water, expecting to see the rescuing sails of the Royal Navy, only to see the muzzles of French cannons pointed right back at him. He was completely cut off, with no retreat and zero hope of reinforcements. What followed was a brutal, systematic dismantling of the British defences. Washington and Rochambeau initiated a textbook siege, digging complex parallel trenches to move their heavy siege guns closer and closer to the British lines. Night and day, American and French artillery pounded Yorktown into dust. The psychological toll on the British troops was unimaginable. They were starving, suffering from smallpox, and trapped under a ceaseless rain of iron and fire. The climax arrived on the night of October 14th, when Allied forces launched a daring, synchronized nighttime assault with unloaded muskets, using only bayonets to maintain absolute silence. They stormed and captured redoubts 9 and 10, the two most critical outer defenses of the British line. With those positions taken, American artillery could fire point-blank into the very center of Yorktown. The situation was no longer desperate. It was completely hopeless. On October 19th, 1781, the unthinkable happened. General Charles Cornwallis, the aristocratic pride of the British military, was forced to unconditionally surrender his entire army. The most powerful empire on the face of the earth had just been brought to its knees, utterly defeated by a ragged army of farmers, frontiersmen, and French allies. It was the death blow to the British campaign in North America. The war was effectively over. Cornwallis was so thoroughly humiliated that he couldn't even bring himself to attend the formal surrender ceremony, claiming he was too sick to hand over his sword. But his true moment of ultimate, soul-crushing humiliation didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened a few days later, in the quiet aftermath of the victory. Cornwallis, now a prisoner of war, requested an audience at Lafayette's headquarters. As the British general walked into the tent, seeking to discuss terms with his aristocratic French equal, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, standing proudly beside the Marquis de Lafayette, wearing the uniform of the Continental Army, was a face Cornwallis knew intimately. It was his loyal servant, his dedicated forager, his most trusted, highly valued spy who had been feeding him crucial intelligence for months. It was James. In that singular, devastating fraction of a second, the horrifying reality crashed down upon the great British general. The bad intelligence that kept him from crushing Lafayette, the false sense of security that led him to trap his own army on a peninsula, the perfectly timed arrival of Washington's forces. None of it was an accident. None of it was bad luck. Into that piercing silence, the truth rang louder than any cannon fire. Cornwallis hadn't just been outfought. he had been completely, systematically, and brilliantly outsmarted. And as he stared into the eyes of the man he had viewed as nothing more than a piece of property, Cornwallis finally realized the bitter, agonizing truth. His entire empire, his invincible army, and his illustrious military career had just been completely dismantled by an enslaved man. With the stunning victory at Yorktown, the independence of the United States was virtually guaranteed. But what about James? Despite the undeniable fact that he had just saved an entire nation, Virginia's 1783 Emancipation Act tragically only applied to soldiers who had actively carried weapons on the battlefield, not to intelligence operatives. Unbelievably, the unsung hero of Yorktown was dragged right back into the brutal chains of slavery. He languished in that terrible condition for 3 more years, until General Lafayette returned to America in 1784. When the Marquis discovered his vital former comrade was still enslaved, he was absolutely outraged. Lafayette personally penned a passionate testimonial directly to the Virginia legislature, detailing James's irreplaceable, heroic contributions to the war effort. Finally, in 1787, James officially won his freedom. To deeply honor the commander who never abandoned him, he adopted the general's surname, proudly living the rest of his life as James Armistead Lafayette. History is usually written by victorious generals and wealthy politicians, but sometimes world-changing victories rest entirely in the hands of the most marginalized people in society. James Armistead Lafayette carried no weapon, but through unparalleled intellect and ultimate bravery, he successfully became the British Empire's absolute worst nightmare. What do you think of this historical masterclass in espionage? Let us know down in the comments, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss out on more bizarre tactics and forgotten history here. See you on the battlefield.